Welcome to the Veritas podcast. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Auron MacIntyre. Auron is a YouTuber, commentator, and a recovering journalist. Very interesting sounding, and I want to get into that in a second, and we will. But first, I just want to say thank you, Auron, for being with me today. I'm very excited to speak with you.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So, to get started, I'm sure that there's a few people in my audience who have seen your content, but there's going to be people who haven't. Can you just sort of introduce yourself in terms of the kind of content that you're creating on YouTube, stuff you're talking about on Twitter? That's where I discovered you personally, but I also got really into your YouTube stuff before I had you on. Talk a little bit about why you make the content that you make. And also, I'd love to hear more about what does it mean exactly to be a recovering journalist?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm somebody. I went to school for politics. It's something I enjoyed. Something I was very interested in since I was young. And so I came out of school after getting a degree in politics. I worked in kind of the establishment kind of GOP politics for a few years on campaigns, campaign staff and stuff. And then I ended up kind of falling backwards into political reporting. I ended up being a reporter at kind of a local newspaper on politics and crime. And so it's one of those things where, this has been something that I've been very interested in my whole life, but kind of like a lot of people around 2016, I started noticing politics wasn't working the way that had been kind of described to me, the way I'd learned in school, the way I had, even, told people about when I was writing articles. And so I started to kind of look for different explanations as to why politics did not seem to function the way I'd been taught and the way, that was kind of generally accepted. I started reading older authors, more obscure kind of political theory. And I just started kind of making videos about that and talking about it on Twitter. And that's kind of how I ended up where I am today.
Yeah, that's very relatable. So for me, I was also very big on like campus politics when I was in college, and I ended up working on some Democratic campaigns, which is kind of hilarious considering my trajectory. It sounds like you kind of started off on the right. How would you describe your political ideology now, if you would, in a couple of words?
Sure. It's one of those things where I think I hate people who are like, oh, labels are useless, because I do think there is some utility in them. Like
Yeah.
we all kind of know what right and left mean, even if we can't put our finger directly on it. So I'm definitely somebody who started out very much in that talk radio conservative world, very much what you would expect for somebody who worked, with GOP politicians and that kind of thing. And then I would say that I've kind of been, like I said, looking at older forms of politics, what a lot of people call reactionary politics, which is looking at the problems with democracy, looking at kind of where our current system and how it functions and how it fails. And you can see a lot of people challenging, even though I do think right and left are real and they do have kind of some explanatory power. You do see a lot of people challenging the way that right and left have been defined in our current system. We have this weird split where we have this kind of economic free market thing on one side, but that's also paired with the idea of kind of, traditional or family values. And then we have this very pro-social form of economics that has been paired with, really social allowance, social acceptance, social, kind of the breaking down of traditional moral standards or the adoption of new ones. And so I think everybody's up in the air a little bit right now as we kind of watch. Obviously, Trump is a big factor in that. You saw, Republicans suddenly become pro protectionism, anti-corporation in many ways. And I think we're all seeing people shift around in that in kind of that milieu right now, and I'm a part of that probably.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think that the left-right description was at least somewhat useful until maybe like 5 or 6 years ago. And with the proliferation of the internet and social media, which was around before 5 or 6 years ago, but really seemed to explode around the time of the 2016 election in terms of its impact on our politics, it seems that the left-right description in and of itself, the kind of binary, is borderline useless. I always think of it as kind of, you got your reactionary right or populist right, you've got your establishment right, your establishment left, you've got your kind of social justice, woke orthodoxy, and then you've got your intellectual dark web / classical liberals. So there's all these different factions that are actually quite unique. So at this point, I almost think that the binary left-right description is almost useless, but there are still labels that are useful, whether it's reactionary or intellectual dark web, classical liberal, progressive, whatever it might be.
Well, we have a really weird thing that we did in especially American politics, which is we took liberalism and we kind of cracked it in half and we spread it across our political spectrum. So the right in America has the economic parts of liberalism, and the left has the social parts of liberalism. And I think that's one of the reasons that our politics is so incoherent, is that we kind of have two parts of the same ideology being fought for by the two major political factions, and then paired awkwardly with with their counterparts in the social or economic realm. And so that I think is part of our schism. I think the most useful right left distinction is kind of hierarchies, like whether you think hierarchies are something natural and to be respected, or if you think there's something that's bad and needs to be done away with. I think that's actually the best functional definition of right and left, though it's not one I think most people would immediately recognize in our classical political landscape in America.
Yeah, I think there's quite a gulf between what is actually most useful when you're trying to look at what's going on in the world and then how most people view things. I think that one way that I've started to view things generally is just sort of heterodox versus orthodox. There was a really great, I forget who actually wrote it, but it was that Twitter thread that Tucker Carlson read out on his show, where there was the mentioning of the fact that, like, had Tulsi Gabbard been a nominee for the Democrats against a Republican nominee, Jeb Bush, you would have had this total flippening of how they would have been treated, because Jeb Bush, very establishment, kind of orthodox in a way, not quite, but sort of. And then Tulsi Gabbard, very heterodox, very much somebody who is not really aligned with the establishment in her own party at all, especially not at this point. And yeah, I hate a lot of things people sort of describe as like it's anti-woke or it's pro-woke. And there's something there, because there is this orthodoxy that just sort of encapsulates everything and creates these binaries in every discussion. But I've started to just sort of say orthodoxy versus heterodox generally.
Yeah, I think you're right that thread was very good in laying out how the average person in kind of the period between 2016 and 2020, for the first time, kind of glimpsed the ruling ideology in the West. They couldn't put a name on it. They couldn't put their finger on it. But for the first time, they could see the outline, and they could see that whether it's Bernie or Tulsi or Trump or DeSantis, the people pushing against it from either direction are getting obliterated in the press. They're getting obliterated in mainstream institutions. And so, yeah, I think that was the great thing about that thread that you mentioned, is that it really put a fine point on how the average person started to see something, even if they couldn't really say what it was.
Yeah, it's definitely, and it's tough because it would be so nice if in this situation you could point to like a very obvious bad guy. I had the distributist on the show a while back. I know he's big in like kind of the reactionary circle. I'm sure you're familiar with him. And I remember talking about how, like, my desire, just as, I don't know, the kind of person I am, just a huge dork, is like, I want there to be a blow up the Death Star moment where, like, the forces of good defeat the forces of evil, as far as the cathedral or the woke orthodoxy, whatever you want to call it, is concerned. But it's very hard because, like you said, no one can quite put on even where the Death Star, who actually is doing all of this. It's, some might call it the deep state. I might call it, I typically like to just refer to it as like the woke orthodoxy. Some people just say the left, and that's really vague. And it makes it very difficult to combat, to the point where it feels like there's a lot of people who've said, well, combating it directly isn't even what we should be aiming to do. And I feel like that's kind of the idea in more reactionary circles.
Well, yeah. So the first step in anything, defeating anything, is being able to name it, right?
Yeah.
And by the way, they know that, which is why they work so hard to keep it difficult to name, right? And so one of the things that people who oppose whatever the ruling ideology is, whatever you want to call it, is that it is distributed. It's distributed across hundreds of different universities, thousands of different academic journals, preparatory schools, media outlets. And because there's no one place to defeat it, like you said, there's no Death Star moment, and it makes it very difficult to rally behind. You could show up at Harvard or the New York Times and shut it down tomorrow, but this thing would still keep rolling, and everybody knows that. And so it is very difficult to assail, not by design. Design is the wrong way to understand it, but it is a selective advantage that has allowed this ideology to stay in place and in power for so long, because you can't name it, you can't nail it down, you can't go to one place and get rid of it. And that's what makes it so resilient.
Yeah, you're very right that when I first started to wake up to this stuff, initially I was like, oh, wow, the college campuses are a nightmare. And it was when I was still in college and I was waking up to how awful that was. And then I went, oh, wow, the media is a nightmare. And then I went, oh, wow, the Democratic Party and to some extent the Republican Party totally overtaken. And then I learned about big tech. I usually think of those four as kind of like, if this is I actually forget the name of the beast, but from Greek mythology with multiple heads, I forget the name.
The Hydra.
The Hydra. That's what I was thinking. It was like on the tip of my tongue. If I think of this as the Hydra, those are kind of the main four things I think about. I want to ask you about one of them as a recovering journalist. I want to ask you about the news media, because to me, that's the one that seems to be on the verge of collapsing. I always think of it as like, it's collapsing without any real intervention from those who would seek to resist it. It reminds me of a War of the Worlds. The aliens end up just, I think, being exposed to oxygen or something, and they all just kind of die. And I think of the media as kind of experiencing something akin to this, because their ratings are just collapsing in the absence of Trump. And they already were when Trump won. And then there was a little bit of a Trump bump. And then mostly in cable news, but also to some extent elsewhere, we're seeing this total collapse. I want to ask you specifically, Auron, from your perspective, is there anything salvageable, not necessarily from the existing media outlets? I think the answer there is obviously no, but just from the concept of sort of 24-hour news media that we had, is there anything salvageable there? And if there isn't, and I suspect that might be your answer, but I'm not sure, but if that is your answer, that there isn't, how do we accelerate the process of these awful institutions, these completely rotten institutions imploding, and then what do we replace them with?
So one of the things I think a lot of people don't think about, which is really important, is like, of course, the media has importance for a number of reasons. Like it's, you can make you famous, it can make you rich. Like there's a lot of reasons people would want to be involved in media. But one of the things that media does in a democracy is it informs the voter. And when the voter is where sovereignty lies, right? That's the idea of democracy, is popular sovereignty. So if you want to rule, what do you need to do to stay in power? Well, you need to control votes, right? You need to control that popular sovereignty. What's the best way to do that? Well, limit what information it receives, or control the type of information it receives. And so one of the things that media does is it's a really, really essential linchpin in the ability of elites to inform the populace as to what they would like their opinion to be. Now, a lot of people think that this means that there's some kind of cabal of people rubbing their hands together in a back room. The Illuminati are planning out everything from, and then don't get me wrong, like there are surely bad actors that work together. But really, if you want to understand the problem with journalism, you need to understand that every journalist, whether they can say it out loud or not, understands that at some point they are wielding power, like way more power than they would have as some random person with a liberal arts degree making $50,000 a year in any other situation. And the incentive for every single journalist, right or left, is to wield that power, because by wielding that power, they climb, right? They become more powerful, they gain status, they get a better audience, they get better jobs, they get offers to move to bigger outlets. There is no incentive to accurately report news. None. There's really none at all. All the incentives are to sensationalize and polarize the news. And so your entire journalistic incentive structure in and of itself, especially in democracy, basically inevitably leads you to where we kind of are. So I think the problems are pretty systemic. I think they're pretty much to the core. I don't know how you generate an actually objective news in the first place, right? Every person comes with opinions and biases. And so in some ways those things becoming apparent of obvious is a good thing, because at least we're not playing this game of like we were playing back in maybe the 1960s, where we pretended like someone was an arbiter of truth because they sat behind a news desk. But rather than than allowing us to just kind of say, oh well, everybody's biased and so we can just kind of go our own ways, what it's really seemed to do is put us into an even more fever pitched war of information. And as the news media, like you said, deteriorates and seems to be losing its power, it becomes even more and more desperate to shove out any alternatives. So I don't know if you saw, but I think the New York Times ran something about how Substack is a danger to democracy in the last few days, right? This
Yeah.
alternative news outlet is a danger to democracy. And why would news alternatives be a danger to democracy unless, of course, democracy is ruled by news sources, right? It's really the only way that comes together.
Yeah.
But it's not something we're ever taught, and so it's hard for us to really think of it that way.
Yeah, I mean, do you think there are any positive examples in the world of new media and sort of decentralized media, whether it's something like maybe the Joe Rogan podcast, where you have this guy who certainly has his own biases, but he has this massive audience and he doesn't exert quite as much rigid control on the conversations he's having as an Anderson Cooper, certainly. Or maybe it's something like Substack, where it's sort of brought down to the level of the individual for the most part. At least that's my understanding of Substack, because everyone kind of has their own little blog almost, if you will. I'm actually not super familiar. Do you think there are any good examples of something akin to not a perfectly objective coverage or dissemination of information, but something approaching it in a way that a CNN or a Fox News or an MSNBC would never do?
I mean, I think there definitely are people doing great work, and I think they deserve credit. I don't think it comes down to the individual people necessarily failing the system, like I said, though clearly many people must be if it's failing. But I think there are plenty of people who are making good efforts to do their best to get out there and tell stories that wouldn't be told, or something like that. But then the question you ask yourself is, well, why are they telling those stories and not other ones, right? Everyone is making selections. Everyone has biases. I think you also have the problem that the more information fractures, the less cohesive we become as a culture. And that's one of the things that I think a lot of people, they look back fondly at maybe the 50s or 60s and say, oh, these were a time, that was a time where we were more together as a country. We had a similar culture and we could all trust the news and that kind of thing. But that was really this kind of apex. It was a kind of point in time where you had just gotten mass media enough to everyone in the country to be connected, but not enough of it to where it had fractured into a bunch of different subcultures. And so there was just this weird hump where for a moment, everybody had to watch the same three channels. And so that really created a mass culture in a way that America never really had before. We weren't really one mass culture before that, and we haven't really been since. But everybody's kind of pining back to that time, and they think that if you can just get objective journalism again, you'll travel back to that magic, point. But I think that was really more the aberration than it is ever going to be the norm.
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting point. It points to the difficulty in striking a balance between decentralizing, news media or information for the masses to the point where there are varying perspectives and they can come to their own conclusions and not just be propagandized. But again, like you're saying, then you get that with the internet, infinite fractionation to the point where there is no common view of the world. I mean, there's a disagreement in our society right now over whether or not men can be women. I mean, people really disagree over like basic questions that it used to be you woke up in the morning, you just knew whether you were a man or a woman or not until not that long ago. I want to sort of take this in another direction, maybe, because it seems like you referred to a moment in time where again, with just the three channels that were all saying more or less the same thing, there was sort of media as a source of common culture. I would say that before that, you had religion, especially Christianity in the United States, as a source of common culture. And that waned significantly through the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s up until today. And then you get to this point where we learn religion is inevitable. You get a new religion. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? How, well, I guess my question specifically is going to be this. This is what I had in my show notes, and I think it would be interesting. If we take my thesis, and feel free to challenge me on this, but this is kind of my general thesis, is that Christianity has waned in influence. The woke orthodoxy has replaced it as somewhat of a common culture in a lot of spaces in the United States, and it's getting stronger every day. Is the best way to combat that with some kind of revival of Christian values? Or is it to come up with something completely new, something that addresses post-modernity and the woke orthodoxy and the proliferation of the internet and social media directly in its founding principles?
Yeah, so I think your analysis about the waning of Christianity and kind of this woke progressivism coming in to fill the void is correct. I think that's the right way to view. Like you said, religion is inevitable. We're innately religious creatures. Again, there was this, the '90s are kind of the same, that kind of golden moment for maybe or I guess '90s, early 2000s, for kind of the new atheist movement, right? Where there was this moment where, like, okay, we've discarded all of the Christianity and the myths, and we don't need this kind of stuff anymore. And then all of a sudden, 15 years into this gold moment for the new atheist movement, basically a progressive religion erupts and buries them, right? Like they get shoved
very
so
quickly.
very quickly. So they get shoved so hard, they actually end up on the right. Right.
Sam Harris. And I was a part of that. I'm guilty as charged, was very much a part of I'm constantly watching Christopher Hitchens, beat the crap out of, destroy these theist, plebs. And then eventually I had the journey of a Sam Harris.
Yeah, well, and Sam kind of bounced back, but you see other people in that movement, people, especially kind of online, people like Carl Benjamin, Sargon of Akkad, who kind of permanently ended up on the right? Yeah. Even though he's still an atheist, just he found himself in a situation where he realized, like, okay, we're not getting rid of this stuff, so I better sign up for the best version of it, and it's certainly not progressivism, right? And so I think you're right that is inevitable, and there are a lot of people who are seeing that. The question is it too late? Can you go back? Can you bring some of those things back? There's of course a lot of speculation on this. What's the half-life on progressivism, right? Like, what's the half-life on this woke version of progressivism? It seems to be burning its fuel pretty quickly, right? It's going through subgroups as fast as humanly possible. If you weren't on board with gay marriage in 2008, you could be the president of the United States as a Democrat, and today you couldn't teach at an average school, right? Yeah. Like you couldn't hold a civil service job. You couldn't have a job basically doing anything that involved something in the public eye, or even at
light speed.
Yeah, even at average corporations. And so the question is, really how long, how can it keep moving at that pace? Does it have to? I don't think anybody knows the answer to that. If you figure it out, then certainly tell us. But I think at some point, the people who are burned out at the end of this do turn around behind them and say, okay, that didn't work. Like this movement ran right past me, ran right over me. What do I turn to? And many of them do then do what a lot of people, like you talked about, they look back and say, okay, well, maybe this Christianity wasn't as crazy. Maybe there, these older forms of spirituality, these older forms of social cohesion, maybe they did actually serve a really important function, to our society. I am myself a Christian. I think that it is essential. I think it's incredibly important. I think everybody should become a Christian. But I think in general, you're just going to have a lot of people who are just burnt out by modernity, and post-modernity, and they are going to be looking back to those older forms of social organization and religion, traditional religion is certainly going to be a big part of that.
Yeah, I mean, I've been wondering if there's space for and if it's time for just a new religion, something that isn't called Christianity, because I don't know, I guess it's perhaps a silly way of thinking of it, but I just think about the time that has elapsed, since the time of Christ and Christianity. It what's happened has kind of fundamentally changed the human experience. I know that these Christian values and the stories of the Bible and the lessons of the Bible are they're primordial on some level. They're always going to be useful, and I think they could be incorporated into something new, though, because I guess the way of phrasing it that is perhaps a little silly, but I think perhaps accurate, is that maybe Christianity needs an update, like kind of like how your iPhone updates every once in a while. I think that after thousands of years, particularly with mass communications and the internet changing the chemicals in our brains to the point where human beings are almost like aliens compared to what they were 2,000 years ago, I've thought that maybe there needs to be actually an entirely new religion, because if religion is inevitable, and as a former, I guess still kind of sort of an atheist, I don't know what the hell to call myself, but as somebody who has certainly softened in their view on religion and definitely conceded that it is inevitable and that it is useful for cultures and societies, I think, okay, if it's inevitable, what does the optimal version of that look like? I'm not sure that it's Christianity, not because Christianity doesn't have great ideas in it, but because I don't know if I think what we're seeing is Christianity's failure to compete with or to deal with the problems of modernity and post-modernity, especially now that the internet has turned us into these alien freaks that just don't act or think like humans did thousands of years ago.
So what the phrase "the optimal religion" in and of itself is the most postmodern thing available, right? Like it is the most utility brain killer of religion. And it's understandable, right? Like this is the most common response from people who go through this phase. It's very understandable, right? It's like, well, then let's engineer this situation out, right? Like let's be rational about it. If I've rationally deduced that religion is necessary, then I will just optimize the correct religion, and then we'll build a better system. The problem is that religion is it's not something you can put on a spreadsheet. It works its magic specifically because you don't adopt it for its utility. You don't, as a culture, it doesn't animate you because it was the most efficient function you could type into Excel. A religion works because you believe it, and because you believe it's fundamentally true, and you pursue it for its own sake. That's where the magic of religion lies. That's where the benefits are harvested. The minute that you're sitting there trying to figure out in kind of a cold and cynical and scientific manner which religion you should parse for optimal application to your society, is the minute it's dead, and there's nothing to get out of it. You can trap the butterfly to better understand it, but you killed it, right? And it doesn't really matter how the understanding the best parts of the dead butterfly doesn't give you a beautiful butterfly anymore. And so I think that's the difficulty, and there is a certain level of just post-enlightenment poison that drips into everybody, right? Like no one's immune to this. We're all touched by modernity. It's kind of unescapable. Everybody has this endless reflection on these kind of things and the need to do what you're saying, and kind of logic it out and parse it out and apply it in its highest utility. But I think, again, the value of religion is that you don't do that. It's something that everybody automatically adheres to and does it for its own sake, and does it because it's the right thing, right? There are many people who adopt woke politics because it's useful to them. That's certainly true. But the reason wokeness is powerful is people believe in it, and they will do it because it's the right thing to do, and they'll to do whatever it takes, to make sure that it happens. The fact that it is now the ruling ideology means that it's also beneficial to them, socially and in a career sense and everything else. But at the end of the day, I think there really are true believers, and that's what makes it useful.
Yeah, I think there's plenty of evidence of that in just how quickly it is able to possess people without a second thought. It seems like people aren't putting that much thought into it as they sort of have taken on this identity of, oh, I'm just another NPC in this sort of woke orthodox army. Yeah, that's very, very interesting. There's a lot to talk about there. There are a few other things that I wanted to discuss, though, after going through your channel. There are just so many things I want to chat about. I want to make sure we talk about the concept of midwits, because this was something that I didn't really, I don't really, I didn't know a ton about it. I'd heard Michael Malice talk about it a couple of times on some podcasts that I listened to. And then I watched your video on midwits and I found it really interesting. Can you just, because there's going to be people in my audience that have no idea what I'm talking about. What is a midwit? Can you just sort of explain your understanding of what is a midwit? Why is it relevant to what's going on right now?
Sure. So we're a society that really values cleverness, right? Being the smartest guy in the room often means you go to the best school, you get the best job, and so everybody knows that this is like an indicator of status, right? Like you kind of want to be able to show people and demonstrate that you have a commanding level of intelligence. And the midwit is somebody who has just slightly above average intelligence. They're never going to be the dumbest guy in the room. They're going to be above average. They're going to do well in school. They're going to perform well, but they're never going to be the smartest guy. And that's a big problem for the midwit, because the midwit is really seeking to climb that social ladder through their intelligence. They're probably not the basketball star. They're probably not going to be the coolest guy in school. But if you're at least the person who is the smartest, then you'll be able to, have some social cachet. You'll certainly get the benefits down the road when you get big jobs and that kind of thing. And so the midwit is always trying to demonstrate their intellectual superiority, but because they don't really have the firepower to get to the top level, they're looking for easy ways to demonstrate that over people where otherwise they couldn't. And so the midwit is usually adopting strategies or outlooks that will allow them to kind of game the system to look a little smarter than they actually are. You'll see the classic midwit move is the spelling correction on Twitter, right? Like, you couldn't come up with anything to actually counter what the person said. You don't have a superior argument. But if you can make them look dumb by saying they used the wrong version of there, then you've won, right? You don't have to actually engage in the argument. That's a way to kind of hack the IQ standard and say, ha, look, yeah, I didn't really have an answer to that, but I don't need to answer it. You're too dumb. You're beneath me because you messed up. You made a typo. That's generally what we mean by midwit.
Yeah, it's a concept that kind of fascinated me because it definitely rings true. I think the example you bring up of the person kind of doing the spelling correction, that goes back so many years, and it's just great to sort of put a name on that, because that goes back to Facebook arguments from 2009. People have been doing this as long as there's been chat rooms on the internet. It's like you have a very well thought out argument, you have that one spelling error, and then that's the end of the argument somehow. But yeah, this concept fascinates me, and it's given birth to a meme template which is very amusing, that I'm sure lots of my viewers have seen, where it's the bell curve for IQ. And then of course you've got kind of like the lower end, and those people, the idea is they've got the right idea. They understand some kind of fundamental truth. You've got the middle, which the midwits are near because they're slightly above average, right? They're in between like 100, 115 IQ. And they've got some kind of horrible misconception. And then you've got the people who are actually quite intelligent on the other end. And they, again, have the same exact idea of what's going on in the world as the people on the lower end. And it creates this kind of interesting alliance between people of maybe somewhat lower intelligence, people of very high intelligence, and then you've got kind of your midwits. And it explains so much of what we see in the media world, where there are these people who are pretty high in their verbal acuity. They're very articulate. They seem to know how to use all the right words to make themselves seem smart. But then when you delve down into their ideas, it's very shallow. And when you delve down into who they are as a person, and they always sort of come off as hypocrites. You'll start to notice these inherent contradictions. You'll start to notice them adopting certain ideas very quickly when it becomes advantageous. I always think of our cable news hosts. It wasn't that long ago that you could see someone like Don Lemon saying things that he would never, ever think in a million years to say now. I remember it was like back in like 2014, he said stuff about the Ferguson riots that would get him fired from CNN. It's only been 7 years since the Ferguson riots. And he strikes me as very much kind of in that midwit category. But the thing, I mean, I'll be honest, one of the things that fascinated me most about the midwit concept is I was like, well, I'm pretty sure in terms of if you just take my IQ, I would fit into this category. But then I went, yeah, but I don't seem to exhibit a lot of these traits. I don't know if I'm as obsessed with deconstruction or if I'm as sort of inherently ungrateful for the society I live in. I seem to have this sort of historical perspective that makes me appreciate it and want to defend it in a way that most midwits don't. As a matter of fact, they want to deconstruct and destroy it. So I want to ask if you can elaborate, maybe delve down deeper into what truly makes a midwit, because obviously there's a lot of people who fall into the, let's say 100 to 115, or maybe it's 100 to 120 IQ range, slightly above average, if you will, intelligence. And I'm pretty sure I fall into that category. That's my impression of myself, at least. I've never actually taken a proper IQ test, so I can't say. For all I know, I'm very dumb or very smart. But if I were to guess, I would say I'm slightly above average intelligence. And so I'm curious if you could elaborate on like what really makes a midwit a midwit. Is it obsession with deconstruction? Is it a lack of historical perspective? What really makes them act this way?
Yeah, so I think it's really important to understand the term is not just for anybody who happens to fall into that IQ distribution, right? You can absolutely have a slightly above average IQ and lead a very happy, productive life with a positive outlook. It's not a term to deride people who just happen to fall inside that band. It is an observable phenomena of people who are in that band who can at times fall into our trap that our culture lays for them. And like you said, one of the keys to that is really deconstruction. In our society, we really have put a premium on the ability of people to break down, especially arguments for what is kind of traditional wisdom, which is why you pointed out that in that IQ curve meme, in that bell curve meme, you generally have someone of low IQ who gets it and someone of high IQ who gets it, and then the midwit who does not. It's because it's something that is so fundamental. Almost everybody throughout history has understood it at some level. And of course, the person who isn't putting a lot of thought into it just accepts it because it makes sense to them. And the person who puts a lot of thought into it accepts it because it makes sense to them. But the person in the middle needs to generate that dominance that we were talking about, that kind of that hack in the cultural system by trying to deconstruct it. And so one of the things you see a lot of times is, for instance, people love to attack low resolution ideas. You're probably familiar with this term, low resolution versus high resolution. Low resolution is, it's not very well fleshed out. It's just the basic understanding of something very dumbed down, versus high resolution where it's much more complicated and hard to grasp, but it's a much better explanation of the same idea, right?
Right.
And so when we are teaching, especially kids in school, or parents are teaching children, if you've ever taught anything to a child, you have to teach it to them at low resolution first, because to just be a human, you need to understand some really complicated things that are very hard to grasp when you're like 6 or 8 or 10. But you have to get them, and you have to get them right away. Like, you need to understand very complex social structures to interact properly most of the time in society, even though you don't understand why, which is why every parent's favorite tool is because I said so, right? Like, because the kid needs to get it right away. You don't have time to explain to them why they can't play in the street. You need them to get out of the street right now because a car's coming, right? And you just don't have time to give them the very high level explanation of why it's important. You got to get out of the street right now so you don't get run down. And we do that with all kinds of different things when we're teaching children. So generally, whether it's God, or it's patriotism, or different things, we will teach kids at young ages low resolution versions of this. This is what God is like. This is why you should be proud of your country. This is why family is important. And they are intentionally low resolution. They're intentionally dumbed down for that kid to understand it. Sometimes they're even contradictory, which is confusing to people, again, only if you've never actually taught kids or raised kids. If you've done that, you understand that this is essential. You have to teach them the dumber version of the thing before you can teach them the smarter version of the thing. They have to move. They have to discard the old version as they age, and get the more complicated version. Midwits usually thrive on just deconstructing low resolution versions of things that they were taught when they were children. So they learn something like America is good because you're an American. You should be proud of where you live. And they say, they get a little older. They learn a couple things about maybe a jaded history or something that's not totally true, and then they write an essay or they give a speech or they say to a teacher, this isn't actually the case, and they get rewarded for that, right? Because they've noticed a level of complexity that wasn't there before, and that's rewarded, deconstructing it. And because they're rewarded for that, they think that this is like the way to get ahead. And so they just continually do this. And this is why you so often see, even their late 30s, 40s, 50s, these people continually coming back and attacking these very low resolution, simplistic versions of complex ideas, thinking that this should still, score them points. They're dismantling child's toys and expecting everyone to cheer for them. And this is why you can often see midwits starting to get very frustrated later on in life, because that trick stops working as effectively as they age.
Yeah, it strikes me that the more I think about this deconstruction process that they learn very early, that they think is so revolutionary and subversive on some level. I think the first time that if you were like me, like a young liberal, and you go like, well, maybe we shouldn't celebrate America so much because we've done some bad things, you feel like this rebellious, cool feeling where it's like, oh, I'm really subverting the system. And then you learn over time that, at this point, you're actually feeding into a system that encourages you to do that. And that also what you were doing never took that much brain power. That's the thing that's stunning about this. It's very easy to do. The whole point of taking a low resolution concept, which is almost like a straw man, is that it's the easiest thing in the world to just knock down over and over again, repeat the process. And yeah, it ends up giving you this mindset that I think, as you pointed out, certainly when you get to the point where you're raising children, it's not going to be anywhere near as useful. And then the older you get and the wiser the people around you perhaps are getting, it's certainly not going to serve you as much. And I think that we can see this phenomenon playing out where the midwits seem to be most prevalent. So in our media, in academia, in the sort of political hack space. I would think that maybe in the big tech space, there are a lot more people who are genuinely quite intelligent, and perhaps they're genuinely more nefarious. But in those other few spaces, in academia, in the sort of political public relations space, and in the media, it seems like the midwits are quite prominent.
You'll find midwits anywhere where this hack gives them a disproportionate advantage. So in the media, it's almost everything. Your ability to parrot this stuff back and navigate this kind of ruling ideology properly is almost your entire skill set for most media operatives. So it allows people who otherwise wouldn't necessarily produce the best work to climb into positions they wouldn't otherwise hold, right? But you're seeing it more and more in places like tech. And the reason is that the reach of the ruling ideology is getting wider and wider. So through your HR departments, you're now seeing more and more people climb inside very serious companies, which is why everyone got very confused when about 5 or 6 years ago, every corporation suddenly sounded just like your average sociology department, right? And so we're seeing that ability for incompetence to climb through this alternative meritocratic system is now gaining ground and moving even into places we thought were impenetrable, which is why STEM is now becoming a disaster. Everyone thought that was the safe haven, right? Assuredly, at least math is safe from this, but you're getting serious people talking about 2 + 2 is 5 because colonialism, right?
Yeah.
And so we see that really nothing is safe at the end as properly attuning yourself to the ruling ideology becomes the primary way to climb in almost every hierarchy. basically competence goes out the window and it becomes the only marker of success.
Yeah, one of the things that's kind of entertaining about this phenomenon, the more that I think about it, and this, my perspective on this comes from the fact that the way that you're kind of a recovering journalist, which is a very interesting way of putting that, is I'm sort of a recovering Democratic operative. Like I worked on Democratic campaigns and was the president of the College Democrats, all that whole shebang. And it gave me perspective on something, which is that people who work in politics, growing up, you watch The West Wing and you go, man, these people are really smart. Or at least on the midway, they're fucking stupid. Like,
Yeah.
You can be actually very dumb and work in politics. And I think one of the reasons is where a midwit at least has to engage in this weird bastardization of alternative meritocratic process. Politics, you just get a script. You're actually told exactly what to say on every single thing that anyone could ever bring up to you. You're like an actor. And actors can be quite dumb too. People think actors are brilliant. Sometimes they are. Some actors are incredible in their way to express emotion or get to something deeper or whatever you want to say. But people who work in politics, I think a lot of them, I think of people in the media, in tech, there's something that makes them at least operate at like the midwit level. In politics, because it literally is just, you're going to get one of two scripts. You're going to get the Republican script or the Democratic script. If you stick to that, you're good to go. Most of the thinking is done for you. You can be quite dumb. Like the people I encountered in the world of politics, and this is part of what made me want to leave, I thought I'd go into it and I'd meet people who are like me, who aspire to that West Wing level of articulation of these grand ideas of governance and political philosophy. And you encounter these people who are just incredibly stupid. It's kind of funny how that turns out.
Yeah, I think this is one of those casualties of centralization, right? So, if you think back way to like the oldest political structure available, right? So like you're going to be a tribal chieftain. How do you get to be the tribal chieftain? Well, you got to basically be a better provider, defender, or organizer than everybody else in the tribe, right? There's really no other way around it. If you're not doing it, someone else is going to like fight you in a duel and take your place, right? So you've got to be hyper competent. You have to be the most competent person, at least on one of those three levels, to run your tribe. But kind of as power expands and you get like this a wider centralization across like multiple tribes, then really if there's like somebody, then say like a king, your ability to control is less based on your competence and your ability to deliver for the common people. It is more your ability to deliver for the king, right? And if you get enough power centralized to the point where we have it now, there's almost no need to be regionally competent. Like look at AOC. Like what does she provide to her actual constituents? Nothing, right? Her money is from outside of her area. Her influence is from outside of her district. Everything that makes her who she is and gives her power comes from someone else, somewhere else, and has no connection to the people she's actually supposed to represent. And so as we move further and further away from kind of regional power bases and closer to those centralized bases, we get to exactly what you're saying, which is basically you just get one of the two power scripts, you read it off, and your value is entirely a function of your ability to be like blindly and stupidly loyal to the people who wrote the scripts. That's really your only value at all, which is why people who are regionally powerful are so dangerous both in the Democratic and the Republican Party, and why you'll see people so quickly attempt to turn on them, because if they can actually like deliver something to constituents, something the constituents haven't seen in 50 plus years, they can build power bases outside of the party, and that really damages the party's ability to create that uniform structure.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I think it speaks to the trajectories of a Tulsi Gabbard versus an Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez when you correlate it to their relative intelligence. I think that there's something there.
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
Yeah. But I want to make sure we talk about another thing I definitely wanted to speak about. It's all the rage right now, if you will. It reminds me of kind of feminism from like 2014 to 2018. We've got something new, critical race theory, something I hadn't heard about until about a year ago. It's something that I definitely want to discuss. I think it genuinely is important. I don't say that as if it's just some fad topic, just as feminism actually was an important thing to be discussed for a time, maybe not in the way that it was, but I want to talk about critical race theory. And I want to start off that part of the conversation with bringing up some, I'm very bad at this. I forget who you retweeted, but you retweeted someone who said something that I thought was brilliant and obvious, sort of intrinsically true. And I want to discuss it, which is, I saw you retweet. It was something to the effect of, there's no such thing as a value-free education. What matters is who chooses the values. Like that's all that you get to do is choose those values, choose who chooses the values. This is so obviously true to me. When I saw that, I went, oh yeah, as I think back to my own education. And generally, I consider myself to have gotten a relatively good education. I grew up in a red area in a blue state. I don't know how much that has to do with the education that I got, but I think I got a pretty good one when I think about the way that I was taught by my teachers. I think I had pretty good teachers. But anyway, I think about how they imparted values onto me, and that was important. That was intrinsic. They couldn't not do that. This is so obvious to me that there's no way to just have this education that is completely free of any moral values at all. This is a ridiculous notion. Nobody could ever possibly believe this. Why is this concept seemingly so difficult for some in the sort of intellectual dark web space to understand right now? Because there's this battle between people like Chris Rufo, who are leading the charge against critical race theory and appearing to have some actual victories and actually doing things that I'm yet to see in this culture war, which is actually genuinely push back on something legislatively, wield power effectively, if you will. Why is there all this pushback that seems to imply, again, that you can just, oh no, let's not engage in any fight over the value structures of our education system, which just seems ridiculous to me.
Yeah, so one of the things that liberalism does, and when we're talking about liberalism here, we're not talking about like Democrat, Republican, like progressive Democrats. We're talking about like classical liberalism. One of the devil's bargains of classical liberalism was basically to say, look, we've had all these religious wars. We've had all these wars and disagreements over, different doctrinal issues and all this stuff. So we're going to put all that stuff on the shelf. And we're just going to take like the minimum necessary stuff that we can agree on to like function as a society. And that'll allow us to like economically cooperate and that kind of thing. And it was a pretty good sell at the beginning, right? Like a lot of people didn't want to be fighting these wars anymore, pretty tired of it. And they really, the economic incentives of a booming market economy were clearly just too big to ignore. And so this seemed like a pretty good deal, right, at first. The problem is that there's no such thing as actually putting those issues on the shelf. There is no value-free space like we talked about with reporting. There is no such thing as objective. Everybody has those values that they filter things through. Everybody has, and this is going to sound postmodern, right? But it's true. Everybody has the lens through which they view the world, and that view necessarily puts some ideas in power and some not in power. And so you're never really creating the space that the IDW would like to believe exists, where you just have rationality in charge, where you just have the objective truth in charge, nobody's values or religion or anything are getting in the way, and you just function on that pure, scientific system or whatever. That doesn't actually exist. Anybody who's imparting knowledge, telling stories, delivering narratives about who we are, how we came to be, what literature is, what values are, what history is, they are necessarily imparting values whether you know it or not. There's no way to escape that. And the only question is going to be whose values. But because liberalism was so good at kind of obfuscating that process, what we ended up with was a value system that was able to kind of fly under the radar. So we had this separation of church and state, right? And separation of church and state sounds great, right? Like everybody just learns the, how math works, and then you go home and your parents teach you, what you believe about different things value-wise. But the problem is what that did is it allowed atheistic, and people will hate this term, but it allows atheistic religions to then outcompete theistic religions, because theistic religions are banned. You're not allowed to teach Judaism. You're not allowed to teach Islam. You're not allowed to teach Christianity. You are allowed to teach progressivism, because progressivism doesn't have a holy book. There's no God. There's no metaphysical discussion directly involved. And so you are allowed to transmit those values. And because you are allowed to transmit those values and only those values through public institutions, and the vast majority of people have to pass through public institutions through either education or work or whatever, the values that become the dominant values of society become the progressive ones, because they're the only one that are allowed to complete in this marketplace of ideas. Everybody else is fighting with one arm behind their back. Progressive wokeism has its run of the show. And so the reason CRT is coming to a head is finally progressivism has mutated into something so hostile to just humanity and to a majority population in the United States that it's becoming too clear what's being taught. You can't pretend anymore that this is value neutral. And so the reason you're having the showdown is you still have people who still believe in this classically liberal story of the secular state, these secular institutions that can operate value free, religion free, without a moral framework, and just be optimized for the best function of society. But it's becoming clear to an increasing number of people, especially on the right, but even some to the middle and the left, that is a strategy doomed to defeat. It has failed for many, many years, and you can see it's only applied to one side, right? You see these people coming out against the banning CRT, but they certainly aren't coming out against the banning of Holocaust denial in many cases. I mean, some of them are, but if it was going to be taught in school tomorrow, right? If schools said we're going to institute a curriculum where Holocaust denial is central to our educational process, I don't think you're going to see a lot of the intellectual dark web coming to bat for that version of free speech in the classroom, right? So we see that really no one's for free speech in the classroom. Everyone has a value system they want taught there, and the only question is which ones are they comfortable being allowed to be expressed in the room with their children.
Yeah, it would seem that we've finally crossed over a certain point where, sort of as you were saying, the evidence has become so overwhelming and so disgusting and demonstrable and so horrific when you actually see it. Somebody almost exclusively actually, Chris Rufo uncovered the incredible ugliness of what is happening at this point, to where it's accelerated, of what critical race theory, how it manifests itself and how awful it is, that he is actually able to have some degree of political support, especially in the establishment Republican state where they still have power in those states, where he can actually take these, what seem initially to many classical liberals as drastic measures. But I think he's winning over some people by showing just how awful it is and how it could be akin to, I think that blood libeling little white kids about how they're all, some 10-year-old white kid is guilty of being a slaveholder through some ridiculous philosophical framework is akin to a Holocaust denial. I actually don't think that should be a controversial statement. And I think we're finally getting to that point where it seems like on some level they've pushed too far. They've taken the mask off. And the way that I always phrase it is, a year ago, I came up with this little catchphrase that I kind of use when I'm discussing these things with people, which is around the time of the George Floyd riots. I started saying, when I would see some of this critical race theory stuff, I would look at it and I would go, oh, that's just bigotry. That's just racism. I would just read something that they were doing and I'd go, oh, that's just awful. No covering it. They're not trying to dress it up at all. There's nothing philosophical about it. It's just nasty, blood libelous bigotry in a different form. And that if I show that to somebody who maybe has some progressive sympathies, they might actually be awakened to how awful it is. And it reminds me a little bit of how, I've been able to sort of, I know a lot of people hate this term, but sort of quote unquote red pill some people in my social circles by showing them what happened at Evergreen College or some of these other catalyzing events for the IDW. But I think we're in a new phase where this thing appears to be a situation where they've overplayed their hand and they've given somebody like Chris Rufo the ability to actually fight back.
Yeah, you've got a very weird escalation, right? So like you said, they've had to, because it's becoming more and more obvious to a number of people what's going on, they have to up kind of the stakes, right? So you'll notice that I forget the charts, but there's these insane charts where it used to be just like bigot or racist, right? And then you notice like what 5 6 years ago, as if someone had flipped a switch, everything was like white supremacist out of nowhere, right? You can see the Google trends where the mentions just go to like 1,000% out of nowhere. And you also see people like the Biden administration floating around are basically ideas like we need to purge anybody who supports Trump out of the military. We need to label Trump supporters domestic terrorists. I mean, it's very clear those are not accidents. Those are we are losing control of narrative. The simply using the softer versions of social control are no longer working, and so we need to ramp these up to much more serious levels, right? And so I think it is clear that they are pushing so hard that is disillusioning many people. But you can really see them start to set the stage, moving from kind of this soft social control to really possibly more, aggressive forms of state power in order to kind of keep this ball rolling and keep people falling in line.
Yeah, we definitely seem to be making them work harder. It seems like we're making them take these drastic measures that slowly reveal them for who they are, to the point where I've been able to convince some people where a year ago they would tell me like, Matt, why don't you like Joe Biden? He's like he's somebody you should like. He's like a reasonable, moderate, normal Democrat. And I knew from the very beginning he was not. And I certainly knew when he selected Kamala Harris as his running mate that he was not. And I've been able to convince more and more people of that because he seems to be in a position, or his administration, I hate to even say he because he's almost irrelevant, but his administration has been doing so many more transparently ridiculous things, for lack of a better way to phrase it, when it comes to sort of all of the sacred cows of this ideology, which is connected to critical race theory. I mean, the Biden administration has taken an official position on the whole transgender issue that I think is coming to a head in many ways, especially when it comes to, sports and all of that. It's this thing, you always think it can't go any faster. It can't accelerate, but it does. It exponentially accelerates, and it's quite a ride, I have to say.
Yeah, you can really see the left. Basically, the only thing is the left really has very few barriers left to its power, right? And you can see them aiming directly at them. Things like basic family bonds. They need to destroy basically anything that's left. It's very Soviet, right? It's very much children, inform on your parents. They might be dangerous Trump supporters. Get them to the gulag before they take out the glorious republic. Like we're really not that far away from that rhetoric. I know it's so hard for people to imagine that, but we're right up there. We're all the logical lines are in place. We're really just looking at physical implementation in some of those scenarios, and so you could really see them needing to ratchet that rhetoric up across the board. I am one of these people who thinks that eventually that runs out, right? Eventually there's no more fuel left to feed into this fire. Not in the sense that there'll be a popular, backlash in a serious way, but people will just get tired. Like people will just stop believing in this stuff because there's just nothing. It just destroys everything around them. There's nothing left to feed into, kind of this absolutely out of control fire. But it's not going to be pretty in the short term, I think.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a desensitization, because where people like you and me became privy to the fact that racist as a term and fascist as a term became utterly meaningless whenever spoken by a certain type of individual. We've done that years ago. And I think more and more people are doing that. There's this desensitization of just like, oh, forget, of course they're saying that. I want to ask before we sign off, I do want to ask, are you he's got a good idea? Is he doing something? I've been very excited by what Chris Rufo is doing. I used to have this thing where I would say like I used to have another show that was more branded on like the intellectual dark web. And we did a show each year called the Intellectual Dark Web MVP. And if I still did that show and I still did that episode, I definitely would have him as like my front runner for 2021. How do you feel about Chris Rufo and what he's doing? Because it's been divisive for a variety of reasons in terms of its efficacy and in terms of its morality. I'm just curious your actual perspective on him and what he's doing specifically.
So obviously, as somebody who's already explained why I don't think there's a value neutral classroom, I think Rufo's right to be trying to get this stuff banned, right? That's the easy answer. That we can end that controversy there, at least on my opinion. The question then for people who agree with the project of banning CRT is Rufo in the end going to be effective? Is that is that an option? So I'll say this: I think Rufo is a good actor. I think he is somebody who is fighting in good faith against something he doesn't think is an ideology he thinks is destructive, and obviously he is doing more than almost anybody else in an activist right wing space has ever done, kind of in living memory almost, right? I do not like people who just straight up bag on Rufo, because I think that is like, we need people who can scrap. Rufo can scrap. He knows how to get in there. He knows how to get things done, at least on certain levels. That said, I kind of think he's doomed to fail, but not because he's like not pure of heart or something. It's because CRT is the ruling ideology of our entire regime. It is the foundation on which the story of our country basically now is taught and encouraged, and on pretty much every level. The American school system has basically been teaching CRT to its kids for at least 20 to 30 years. It's just ramping up to the point where now you can like see it and name it. And so removing there's a Curtis Yarvin is a political theorist, and he said getting CRT out of American schools is like getting the shit out of sewage. And I think that's probably right. Like, I understand like water treatment plants exist, but you know what I'm saying? Like it stops being sewage at that point. And that's kind of American schools when it comes to CRT. CRT is like we talked about with with kind of social justice in tech and other workplaces. This wokeness is how many people climb the ladder. It's how people sort their status inside our society. It's how they defeat their enemies. They cancel them with it, and then they rise. And you don't just dispose of something like that that's extremely useful to the vast majority of people by like banning it out of a school with a with an executive order. That said, I don't think you should stop. I'm not. This is not me saying like don't try to do this. Don't. It's a fight worth having, if only because, as one of my friends said, CRT is kind of the end state of this stuff where there's a place people can write a check, right? Like Robin DiAngelo is getting rich off this stuff, right? And anytime you can kind of rob your enemy of cash flow, you're doing something. You're not doing nothing, right? These people want budgets. They want to use this stuff to control money. At the end of the day, they want a paycheck off this. They certainly believe in it, but they're not going to do it the way they're doing it if it doesn't secure the bag at the end of the day. And so I think there is value in getting this stuff banned where you can. Just don't think that a governor somewhere signing an order saying that CRT can't be taught in your school doesn't mean your kid isn't learning 60 to 70% of that stuff anyway, just like they were before it had a name, critical race theory.
I think your perspective, Auron, is very similar to mine on Rufo. I think that I like him a lot. I think, just as you said, he should keep doing what he's doing. Definitely, my impression of what he's doing has always been his hypothetical success has a too good to be true quality. It has that blow up the Death Star quality that seems impossible at this point. But does that mean he shouldn't try? Hell no. I've enjoyed seeing him do what he's doing, and it definitely gives me a good feeling to do that. I know we blocked out about an hour, so I'm going to have a sign off in a second, Auron. But before we do, thanks again for being on the show. I want to give you an opportunity to just let people know where they can find your work. Anything you want to plug or promote, fire away.
Sure. Yeah, they can just find me, Auron MacIntyre, on Twitter, and the YouTube channel has the same name. If you go to my Twitter, I've got a link tree there that'll take you to everything I do. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Those are my two main platforms. I do have an Odyssey and a Rumble channel just for people who want to consume on alt tech rather than on YouTube and that type of thing. But yeah, you can find all that stuff there.
All right. So everybody can check out Auron on his social media. Thanks for tuning in today to the Veritas podcast. If you're listening on YouTube, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. If you are listening on iTunes, please give a 5-star review. It helps get the show out to more people, really helps with the algorithm. I am at the mercy of the algorithm, unfortunately, but I really appreciate all of that. Thanks again for listening. I'll see you guys next time.